Hi, I'm Andrew K. Wallace. Picture a commodities trading floor in early 2026. Not the chaotic kind you see in movies. This one is quiet. Too quiet. On a large screen, crude oil contracts are settling in a currency that isn't the US dollar. A trader adjusts a hedge, pauses, and double-checks the settlement instructions. The transaction clears. No alarm, no headline. Just another trade executed outside a system that used to be unquestioned. That moment is easy to miss, but it matters. For most of your life, the dollar hasn't just been money. It's been infrastructure, the default language of trade. Oil priced in dollars, debt issued in dollars, reserves held in dollars. That arrangement didn't exist because the dollar was perfect. It existed because it was convenient, liquid, and backed by a system that promised stability. What's changing now isn't confidence overnight. It's incentives over time. The BRICS bloc and a growing circle of aligned economies aren't trying to overthrow the dollar. That framing is too dramatic. They're doing something more pragmatic. They're reducing exposure, settling trade in local currencies, holding fewer dollar reserves, building parallel payment systems. None of this requires coordination at scale. It only requires enough participants to decide that dependency is a risk, and dependency always becomes a risk once leverage is used. Here's the quiet part. The dollar's dominance allowed the United States to run persistent deficits without immediate consequence. Dollars exported through trade returned as demand for treasuries. It was a loop, elegant, powerful, rare. But loops only work while participants believe they benefit equally. Sanctions policy changed that calculation. Again, not as a moral judgment, but as a risk assessment. If access to the dollar system can be restricted, then holding dollars carries geopolitical exposure. For countries outside U.S. influence, diversification isn't ideological, it's defensive. So they act. Slowly. Methodically. This is why de-dollarization doesn't look like a collapse. It looks like erosion. A percentage point here. A bilateral trade agreement there. A central bank adjusting reserve composition quietly. Over time, the cumulative effect matters. The pivot point isn't when the dollar loses reserve status. That's a headline event. The pivot point is when marginal demand weakens, when the next buyer hesitates, when the U.S. has to offer higher yields to attract the same capital. That's when life starts to feel different. Let's bring this down to the ground. Fuel, bread, essentials priced globally. When the dollar weakens structurally, imports cost more. Not because of a crisis, but because purchasing power shifts. Inflation becomes stickier. Rates stay higher longer. Credit tightens. You don't wake up one day in a new system. You adjust slowly. Groceries cost a little more. Gas prices stay elevated. Mortgage rates don't come down the way they used to. Each change has an explanation. Energy markets, supply chains, fiscal policy. All true, none complete. The outdated belief here is that reserve currency status is permanent. That once earned, it's owned. History disagrees. Reserve currencies rotate, not because empires fall dramatically, but because their obligations outgrow their credibility. Concrete example. When a country imports more than it exports for decades, it exports claims, IOUs. Those IOUs are only attractive as long as holders trust future value. Trust isn't binary. It fades at the margin. BRICS nations aren't abandoning the dollar. They're reducing the need for it. Settling oil trades in yuan. Using gold as a bridge asset. Creating clearing systems that don't touch U.S. rails. Each step small, together, structural. Smart money understands this distinction. That's why you see sovereign wealth funds diversifying reserves. Why commodity producers accept alternative settlement. Why private capital holds more real assets and fewer promises. This isn't about the end of the dollar. It's about the end of dollar monopoly. And monopolies always erode. The U.S. response so far has been muted, because acknowledging the shift publicly accelerates it. Better to manage it quietly, extend duration, maintain confidence, hope growth outpaces adjustment. That strategy works until it doesn't. The structural limit comes when fiscal needs collide with reduced external demand, when deficits must be funded more domestically, when rates rise to attract buyers, when debt service crowds out other spending. At that point, choices narrow. Ordinary people feel this not as geopolitics, but as constraint. Fewer policy options, tighter budgets, a sense that the system is less forgiving than it used to be. Here's another moment you might recognize. A credit card rate that never comes back down. A car loan that costs more even with good credit. A savings account that earns less than inflation. These are not random. They're symptoms of a currency losing some of its external subsidy. Reserve status was a subsidy. The paper empire wasn't built on paper alone. It was built on trust, liquidity, and the absence of alternatives. Alternatives now exist, imperfect ones, but good enough. And good enough is all markets need. This doesn't mean the US becomes irrelevant, far from it. It means it becomes normal, subject to the same constraints other nations face. Normality feels like decline when you're used to exception. The psychological adjustment is harder than the economic one. There's also a control dimension. When trade fragments across currencies, transparency declines. Settlement takes longer. Hedging costs rise. Financial plumbing becomes more complex. That complexity favors large players, those with scale and access. Small firms pay more. Consumers absorb it downstream. This is how systemic shifts redistribute power without announcing themselves. The final assumption to let go of is that this process can be reversed easily. Once trade routes diversify and reserves rebalance, returning to a single anchor is unlikely. Multipolar systems don't revert, they entrench. So when you hear debates about whether the dollar is finished, understand that the wrong question is being asked. The right question is how much optionality remains as dominance fades. Because reserve currency status wasn't just about money, it was about freedom of action. The ability to absorb shocks others couldn't. The ability to delay hard choices. As that buffer thins, choices arrive faster. For those unprepared, the future doesn't arrive with a crash. It arrives with a series of small adjustments that never quite reverse. A sense that the ground rules changed while no one was watching. Power doesn't disappear in these moments. It redistributes, quietly, through settlement systems, trade agreements, and balance sheets. And by the time most people realize the paper empire no longer sets the terms by default, they aren't angry. They're confused. Because nothing broke all at once. It just stopped working the way it used to. That's life after the reserve currency. Not chaos, constraint. And in constrained systems, survival belongs to those who anticipated the shift before the margins disappeared.